I saw it myself. That first moment of real, terrifying closeness in the Starseeker's cramped mid-bay. Vaughn was leaning over him, her fingers hovering just above the thick, dense ridge of his shoulder. Truth is, I don't think they even noticed me standing by the environmental monitors. The air smelled of ozone and recycled oxygen, sharp and clinical. But the heat coming off Kaylin's body was something else entirely. It was like standing next to a cooling engine block. When she finally pressed her palm against his skin, the contrast was staggering. Her hand looked so fragile, so light, against the sheer mass of him. He didn't flinch. He just looked up at her with those eyes that had seen the crushing depths of the iron cradle, and for a second, the whole ship seemed to tilt on its axis, not from a mechanical failure, but from the sheer gravity of that gaze. But look, it wasn't always like that. To understand how they ended up in that small circle of light, you have to understand the mess we were in 2 days prior. We found him drifting in a jagged shard of an iron cradle scout ship, a relic of a world where the gravity is so high it turns bone to something closer to titanium. When the tractor beams locked on, we thought we were hauling in scrap metal, maybe some high-density alloys we could trade at the next outpost. We didn't expect a living, breathing powerhouse. Kaylin Thorne didn't just walk onto our ship, he fell onto it with the force of a tectonic plate shifting. His biology was a superpower in our neck of the woods. See, where we come from in the Zephyr Collective, the air is thin and the gravity is a polite suggestion. On the iron cradle, gravity is a physical weight you carry from birth. It builds bones like steel and muscles that ripple with a terrifying kind of potential energy. The intake procedure was a disaster. I remember the way the deck plates groaned under his boots as he stepped out of the airlock. Our security drones tried to pin him down, but it was like trying to stop a landslide with silk ribbons. He wasn't even being aggressive, really. He was just moving. Kinetic problem solving, he called it later. But in that moment, seeing him shrug off pulse rounds like they were summer gnats, we were all terrified. Vaughn was the only one who didn't run. She stood her ground while the rest of us scrambled for the emergency bulkheads, and that was the first spark. Not a romantic one, not yet. It was the spark of recognition. Vaughn saw the way he looked at the ship's failing life support readouts, not with the eyes of a conqueror, but with the focused intensity of a man who knew how to fix things that were breaking. He saw our fragility, and for some reason, he decided to be gentle. I watched him from the observation deck as he sat in that containment cell later, his head bowed, his hands resting on his knees. Those hands could have torn the hull open, but instead, they just stayed still, waiting for us to stop being afraid. But the fear didn't leave Vaughn. It just changed into something else, something that drew her toward the medbay that night, driven by a need to understand the man who was built for a world that would have crushed the rest of us into dust. It was the Iron Cradle's gift, I suppose, a strength so absolute it had no need for cruelty. I watched the hull buckle like it was made of parchment when the first swarm stalker slammed into the side of the Starseeker. Those predators are fast, all jagged edges and hunger, and our little scavenging ship wasn't built for a siege. The alarms were screaming, a high, panicked trill that made my teeth ache. But through the smoke and the flashing red lights, I saw Kaylin. He wasn't panicked. He stood in the center of the engineering deck, his feet planted wide, looking like an anchor dropped into a storm. Truth is, the rest of us were already saying our goodbyes, but Vaughn, I'll never forget the way she ran to him. She didn't bark orders or play the cold captain. She just grabbed his arm, her small hand straining against the corded muscle of his forearm. I saw the way his skin rippled under her touch, reacting to the heat of her panic. He looked down at her, and for a second, the chaos of the ship just faded. He leaned in close, his forehead almost touching hers. I could hear his breath, deep and steady, a rhythm that seemed to calm the very air around them. He didn't use a wrench or a plasma welder when the main coolant line snapped. He used his hands. I saw the steam scalding his skin, the hiss of it loud enough to drown out the sirens, but he didn't even grunt. It was brute force logic in its purest form. He literally held the ship together, his body acting as a bridge for the failing systems. His biology wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was our only hope. The Iron Cradle's gift wasn't just the strength to survive the gravity of a dead world. It was the endurance to hold on to what mattered when everything else was falling apart. The vibration of the engines changed then. It went from a dying whine to a deep resonant thrum that vibrated in my very marrow. Kalen had rerouted the power through the secondary conduits by sheer physical will, forcing the ship to breathe again. And when the stalkers came for the final breach, he was there. He didn't need a weapon. He was the weapon. I saw him move with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for someone that heavy, a blur of kinetic energy that sent the predators reeling back into the void. After it was over, when the stars were steady again, and the only sound was the soft hum of the life support, I found them in the observation lounge. They weren't talking. They were just sitting on the floor, backs against the glass, watching the nebula swirl outside. Kalen's hand was resting palm up on the deck, and Vaughn had her fingers laced through his. Her head was on his shoulder. That same heavy, steel-dense shoulder I'd seen her touch in the medbay. I suppose some might say he was still a captive, bound by loyalty instead of bars. But I saw the way he looked at her, and the way she looked at him. He wasn't a prisoner. He was the guardian of the collective, a man who had found a reason to use his terrifying strength for something other than survival. He had been adopted by the stars, and in the process, he'd given us a future we didn't think we'd live to see. I stood there for a long time just watching them breathe in the quiet. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen.